Hello everyone, happy Wednesday. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. I'm Miss Rachel and I'm here to share a story with you today. This week our theme is tales in threes, because if you notice there are a whole lot of fairy tales out there that deal with the number 3. You've got Goldilocks and the 3 bears, you've got the 3 little pigs, there's the 3 billy goats gruff, and that's just a few of them. There's all kinds of stories that have the number 3 in them. So this week, we're sharing a bunch of those stories with you. Today's story actually has 3 sets of 3s in it. The story is called The Giant with the 3 Golden Hairs. So that's one set of 3 right there. But if you listen real close to the story, you'll be able to pick up what the other 2 sets of 3s are, okay? I'll give you some hints as I tell the story, and then once we finish the story, we'll talk about it and we'll figure out what the 3 sets of 3s were. This also happens to be my very favorite fairy tale of all time, so I'm really excited to share it with you all. Okay? So let's get started. The Giant with the 3 Golden Hairs. Now this story takes place in a vast kingdom that was ruled by a very greedy, very kind of snobby king. He thought he was better than everybody else because he had all this money. And all he cared about was gold. He loved gold and he loved being better than everybody else. He thought he was the best because he was the king. So in this vast kingdom, there was a little boy born with a caul over his face, which basically means he was born with what looks like a veil over his face. And in this kingdom, anyone born that way was considered to be lucky. Furthermore, it was prophesied that this boy would one day grow up to marry the princess. That sounds pretty lucky to me, doesn't it? I mean, you know, he's a pretty lucky kid. Now, this king liked to travel all throughout his kingdom and just ask around, see what all the gossip was, find out what's going on from this end of the kingdom to that end of the kingdom. So not long after this boy was born, the king made his way into this little village and he said, "Oh, what's the gossip? What news do you all have?" And of course, everybody was so excited. This baby was born with a caul over his face. That means he's lucky, and it's also prophesied that he's going to marry the princess one day. Now, the king did not like the sound of that at all. He thought to himself, no daughter of mine is going to marry some poor peasant. She's much better than that. So he thought to himself, I must find a way to rid my daughter of this would-be suitor. So he made his way to the boy's house and he spoke to his parents and he asked them to give him the child and said, I'll go raise him in the castle. You know, since he's going to marry a princess one day, he needs to be living in the castle. But the parents, of course, they loved their child very much and they didn't want to give him up. But finally, the king offered them lots and lots of gold. And he also reminded them, hey, wasn't this kid born lucky? So surely everything's going to turn out all right for him, right? This is his lucky break. He's going to the castle. So finally, the parents were convinced and they gave him the child. Now remember, this king is wicked and he's not a very nice guy. So once he got a ways away from the family, he took the child and he put him in a little wooden box. He put the lid on it, and then he dropped that box in the river and sent it off floating down the river. And he thought to himself, that's that. I've rid my daughter of this would-be suitor for good. But remember, this boy was born lucky. And this box just floated along very nicely on the river, and eventually it made its way to the mill. The miller saw the box and he fished it out of the river, wondering, oh, maybe there's treasure inside. When he opened it up, he did find a treasure. He found a little baby who was perfectly dry, perfectly healthy, unharmed, and happy. So the miller took the child home. Now, he and his wife didn't have any children of their own, so they adopted this boy, and he became their son. And so it was that he grew up to be the son of a miller. This boy grew, and he became handsome and strong and clever, but most importantly, he was a kind young man. So several years later, after he'd grown up, the king happened by that part of his kingdom, and he saw this strapping young lad working at the mill, and he asked the miller, is that your son? And the miller said, well, yes, he's our adopted son. You wouldn't believe how we found him. And the miller told the king all about the strange box floating down the river. Now the king immediately knew that this was the child that he'd heard about all those years ago, this child that was prophesied to marry his daughter. And the king thought to himself, I thought I'd gotten rid of that kid. I'm going to have to come up with something else. So the king asked the miller, would your son be willing to take an urgent message to the queen for me? I've got many miles more to go before I can get back home, and I have a really important message for her. I'd pay you for it. And the miller said, of course, our son would be happy to, anything to serve the king, right? So the king took out a little piece of paper and he wrote a note on it. He wrote it so they couldn't see, but what he wrote was, have this boy put to death as soon as he arrives at the castle. And then he sealed it up and tied it tight, and he gave it to the boy, and he said, deliver this to the queen and have her read it immediately upon your arrival. Watch to make sure she reads it, because of course the king wanted to make sure that the boy was there when the queen read the note, right? And so the boy said, absolutely, I will do this. And he took the note and he went off on his way towards the castle. And the king thought to himself, that is that. I have rid myself of that boy for good. Now, it was a long way from the mill to the castle, so the boy decided to take a shortcut through the woods. But it was kind of late in the day when he got started, so by the time he got deep into the forest, it was dark and he was having trouble seeing which way he was going. And the boy thought to himself, if I try to keep going tonight, I'm just going to end up getting lost, and I'm going to end up further away from the castle than I need to be. So I should probably find some place to rest for the night. So the boy looked around. As he was trying to find a good tree to sleep under, he saw a light up in the distance, and he thought, maybe there's a house or a cottage up there. So the boy went on his way, and he found the light, and there he found a little cottage right in the middle of the woods. And so the boy went up to the door, and he knocked on the door, and a little old lady answered. And the boy said, excuse me, I'm on my way to the castle with an urgent note from the king for the queen. But it's late and it's dark and I don't know for sure where I'm going and I'm afraid to get lost. Could I possibly stay here tonight? A little old lady said, of course, I would love to accommodate you. However, you should know that this house is actually owned by my son and his friends, and they're a pretty nasty band of robbers. They don't usually like strangers in their house, and they probably wouldn't be too pleased to find you here. The boy said, well, it's so late and I'm so lost. I'll risk it. Why not? So the old woman let him in, and she gave him something to eat, and then he curled up by the fire and he fell fast asleep. Now, not long after that, that band of robbers came by, and they were not too pleased to see this strange guy in their house. But the old woman said, have pity on him. He's on his way to the queen with an urgent message from the king. He's lost, it's late, just let him sleep here, right? So the robbers thought to themselves, a message from the king. I wonder if he's getting paid for that. Maybe we ought to take that note ourselves and get the money. So the robbers went and they snuck in his pocket and they took the little note out. But of course these robbers were pretty curious guys. They were a little nosy, so they thought, I wonder what the note says. So they opened it up and they read that the boy was to be put to death immediately upon his arrival. Now remember, this boy is born lucky. So lucky for him, the robbers took pity on him when they saw that note. They were not too happy about it. They said, that's not even fair. This boy's going to his doom and he doesn't even know it. Like, we're robbers. We're not the best people around, but even we wouldn't stoop that low. So the robbers decided to help the boy out. So they took the note and they rewrote it to instead say that the boy should be married to the princess immediately upon his arrival. They forged the king's signature again. They sealed it up nice and tight, and then they slipped it right back into the boy's pocket. He slept through the whole thing. The next morning, the boy woke up, the robbers pointed him in the right direction of the castle, and off he went. And he made it there pretty quickly. And when he got there, he told the queen, you're supposed to read this note right away. So the queen opened it up, and when she saw what it said, she called to her daughter, the princess, and said, come here, love, come here. Your father has found you a husband. Do you like this guy? Would you like to marry him? Now this princess, she was absolutely beautiful, ravishing. She was regal. She held herself well. Most importantly, she was very kind, just like the boy was. And when she looked at him and he looked at her, they recognized that kindness in their eyes, and they fell in love immediately. Love at first sight for both of them. So of course, both of them were like, yes, sure, we'll marry each other, absolutely. And so the queen said, that's that then, and she had them married that same day. Now imagine the king's surprise when he came back to the castle and found that boy. Not only was he still alive, but now he was married to the princess, just like the prophecy said. The king was not too happy about it. He called to his wife and demanded, what happened to my note? What have you done? And the queen said, well, I did exactly what your note said. And the king said, what are you talking about? So the queen showed him the note. The king read it. He said, "This is not the note that I gave that boy." He called the boy to him and said, "What is the meaning of this?" And the boy said, "I don't know. It was still sealed when I got here. It must have been changed in the night while I was sleeping, you know?" And the king said, "Well, you're not going to get away with this so easily. Anybody who's going to marry my daughter, the princess, needs to prove their worth to me in some way." Now, this boy, of course, he loved his wife. He loved the princess very much. And so he looked the king right in the eye and he said, "You give me any task at all, and I will do it. I will do whatever it takes to prove my worth to you." So the king thought about it. He thought, I need to give him an impossible task, one that he'll never be able to complete, one that will get rid of him forever. So then the king said, "There's a giant in this kingdom. Surely you've heard of him. He's not a very nice guy. He hates people, you know. People try to avoid him. This giant has solid gold strands of hair. If you want to prove your worth to me, you need to bring me 3 golden hairs from the giant's head. Only then will you prove your worth." So the boy said, "Absolutely, I will do that." And he set out right away on his way. Now the boy went down the road quite a ways until eventually he came to a town, and this town had a gate all around it, and there was a man sitting there. He was a gatekeeper, and the man saw the boy coming and he said, "What do you know?" Now in this land, what do you know is kind of like saying, who are you? What do you do? What is your purpose here? Why are you coming into our town? You know, so the man said, "What do you know?" And the boy said, "Well, I know everything." And the man said, "Oh, you know everything? Well, if you know everything, perhaps you can tell us why we have this magic well right in the center of our town that used to produce the sweetest wine, and we would sell it, and that was how we made our fortunes. But now this well has dried up and can't even produce water, and no one knows why. Do you?" And the boy said, "If you let me pass through your town, I will have that answer for you when I return." So the gatekeeper let him in. The boy passed through the town, and when he got to the other side of the town, he went back onto the road and went down a ways, and eventually came to another town with another gate and another gatekeeper. And that gatekeeper asked him, "What do you know?" And the boy again said, "Well, I know everything." And the gatekeeper said, "Oh, if you know everything, perhaps you know this to answer for me. We have a magic apple tree in the center of our kingdom. It used to produce golden apples, solid gold apples, and we would sell these apples, and that's how we made our fortune. But now the tree is sick and can't even produce leaves, and no one can tell us why. Can you?" And the boy said, "If you let me pass through your town, I will have that answer for you when I return." And so the gatekeeper let him in, and the boy passed through the town. Eventually he came out the other side, went further on down the road, and eventually he came to the river. Now the giant's house was on the far side of the river, but the boy was looking around trying to figure out how he was going to cross when he came upon a little man sitting in a boat. And the little man called up to the boy, "What do you know?" And the boy said, "Well, I know everything." And the little man said, "Really? If you really do know everything, maybe you can tell me this. Why is it that I have been stuck in this boat for years, going back and forth, and carrying people across the river, but I'm not able to get out of the boat myself? Do you know why?" And the boy said, "If you take me across the river and wait for me there, I will have that answer for you when I return." And so the little man said, "Absolutely, come on in the boat." He brought the boy into the boat, he rowed him across, and he waited for him when the boy got out on the other side. The boy went on a ways until eventually he came to the giant's house. Now, I've got a little giant back here. You know, he doesn't have golden hair, but it gives you an idea how big a giant is compared to a little person, right? So, if you come up to a giant's house, you know, the window is going to be way above your head. So the boy climbed up until he got to the window and he peered inside. Now the giant wasn't there, but his grandmother was. So the boy took a chance and he knocked on the window. The grandmother came over to the window and said, "What is it that you want? You know, it's not safe for you to be here. My son does not like humans, so it's not safe for you here." And the boy said, "I know, but I have to be here, you know." And he told her all about his wife and his bride and how the king wasn't pleased with their marriage and how he'd sent him on this impossible journey in order to prove his worth. And believe it or not, because, again, this boy is lucky, the giant's grandmother took pity on him, and she said, I will help you. I will get those 3 hairs for you. And the boy said, okay, thanks, but I have 3 other questions, if you could possibly help me find an answer to those too. And the grandmother said, okay, what are your questions? And so the boy told her about the well, and he told her about the apple tree, and he told her about the little man in the boat. And the grandmother said, here's what we'll do. I'm going to shrink you down to the size of an ant, and then I'm going to hide you in my little pocket here. And then you need to stay awake all night and listen very carefully, and then maybe you'll get your answers. So the boy said, okay. She shrunk him down, she stuck him in her pocket, and she went back to what she was doing. Eventually the giant came home and he sniffed the air. I smell human flesh, he said. Has someone been in my house? The grandmother said, oh no, of course, don't be silly. You're probably just smelling the leftovers I've been cooking for you. Come, have some dinner. So the giant sat down, he ate a hearty meal. He got late, he started to get tired. His grandmother said, come, lay down on the couch, put your head in my lap, and I will sing you to sleep. So the giant said, okay. He laid down, put his head in his grandmother's lap. She gently stroked his hair and sang a soft lullaby. And the giant's eyelids got heavier and heavier until he fell asleep. Once he was good and asleep, the grandmother grabbed a hold of one of those golden hairs and yanked it out of his head. The giant jerked awake. Woman, what are you doing? He said. Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry, the grandmother said. I had a nightmare, and I must have grabbed a hold of your hair in my fear. And the giant said, what did you dream about, grandmother? And she said, oh, I dreamed that there was a well that used to produce the most delicious wine, but now it's dried up and can't even produce water, and no one knows why. And the giant laughed a hearty laugh. Oh, if they only knew! If they only knew that there's a giant toad living in the base of that well, and he's drinking up all that wine as it's produced. And all they need to do is get down there and find that toad and get him out of there, and the well would start to produce again. If they only knew. The grandmother laughed. Ah, ha, ha, I see, very clever. Now, I'm sorry to have woken you up. Let's go back to sleep, shall we? So she gently caressed his hair and sang a soft lullaby. And the giant's eyelids began to get heavier and heavier until he fell asleep. And once he was good and asleep, the grandmother grabbed a hold of another golden hair and yanked it out of his head. The giant jerked awake. Woman, what are you doing? He said. The grandmother said, oh, I'm so sorry. I had another nightmare. The giant said, oh, what did you dream about this time? And she said, I dreamed that there was a tree that used to produce golden apples, but now it's gotten sick and can't even produce leaves, and no one knows why. The giant laughed a hearty laugh. Oh, if they only knew! If they only knew that there is a rat who's made its home among the roots of that tree, and it's eating the roots for his food, and that's what's making the tree sick. If they just got the rat out of there and took him far away from the tree would be healthy again. If they only knew. And the grandmother laughed. Ah, ha, ha, I see. Very clever, very clever. Now, I'm very sorry for waking you again. Let me sing you back to sleep. So she began to gently stroke his hair one more time. She sang a soft lullaby. The giant's eyelids grew heavier and heavier until he fell asleep. Once he was good and asleep, the grandmother grabbed a hold of one of those golden hairs and yanked it out of his head. Woman, what are you doing? That's 3 times now you've woken me up, the giant called. The grandmother said, I can't help it if I have nightmares. What am I supposed to do? So the giant sighed, ugh. Tell me what you dreamed about this time. And the grandmother said, well, I had a dream that there was a man in a boat who was cursed to go across the river back and forth, carrying people across the river, but he was never able to get out of the boat himself, and he didn't know why. The giant laughed a hearty laugh. Oh, if he only knew! If he only knew that his oar is enchanted, and all he has to do is hand that oar to someone else, and then they'll be stuck in the boat, and he'll be free. If he only knew. The grandmother laughed. Ah, ha, ha, very clever. I see. Now, I'm so terribly sorry to have woken you again. Let me sing you back to sleep. And so the grandmother gently stroked his hair, and she sang a soft lullaby. And the giant's eyelids grew heavier and heavier until he fell asleep. And now, since she had the 3 hairs, and she had the answers to the 3 questions, the grandmother let him sleep the rest of the night in peace. The next morning, the giant woke up, had a hearty breakfast, and then went out to, go terrorize the locals, do giant stuff, right? Once he was good and far away from his house, the grandmother pulled the boy back out of her pocket. She grew him back to his regular size, and she said, "Were you listening? Did you stay awake?" And the boy said, "Yes, I did." And the grandmother said, "Then you have your answers, and here are your 3 golden hairs." And the boy thanked her, and he went back on his way. When he got back to the river, there was the little man in the boat, waiting for him just like he said he would. And the little man said, "Do you have an answer for me?" And the boy said, "Yes, I do, but first I need you to row me back across the river." So the little man led him in the boat. He rowed him back across the river, and once the boy was back on the shore, on the other side of the river, he called down to the man, "Your oar is enchanted. You need to hand it to someone else, and then they'll be stuck in the boat and you'll be free." So the man thanked him, and the boy went off on his way. And he went back onto the road, and eventually he came to the town with the apple tree. And when the gatekeeper saw him, he said, "Do you have an answer for us?" And the boy said, "Yes, I do." He said, "There's a rat who's made its home among the roots of that tree, and he's eating the roots for his food. You need to find the rat, get him out of there, and get him far away from the tree so that the tree can heal itself." So the people of the town, they went looking, they dug around until finally they found this gigantic rat who'd grown so fat from eating all these roots. They could hardly get him out of there, but they pulled and they pushed and they pulled and they pushed till finally they yanked that rat out of there and took him far away from that tree. Immediately the tree began to heal itself and started to produce gold apples again. And everyone in that town was so grateful to the boy that they gave him a donkey with 2 gigantic bags full of gold sitting on it. And they sent him on his way. So the boy went on his way back down the road with his donkey with its 2 big bags of gold, until eventually he came back to the town with the well. And when the gatekeeper of this town saw him, he said, "Do you have an answer for me?" And the boy said, "Yes, I do." He said, "There is a toad living at the base of that well, drinking up all the wine as it's produced. You need to get down there, find that toad, get him out of there, get him far away from the well, and then the well can start to produce again." So they sent somebody down into the well. They looked around, and eventually they found this toad that had grown so fat from drinking up all this wine that he was almost too heavy for them to lift. But finally, they were able to lift him out of that well and take him far, far away. And immediately they could hear liquid gurgling underneath the well again. And when they drew down a bucket, up came the most delicious wine, even more delicious than what they had before. And they were so grateful to the boy that they also gave him a donkey with 2 big bags full of gold on it. And so it was that eventually the boy made his way back to the castle with 2 donkeys, 4 big bags of gold, and of course, the 3 golden hairs that he'd gone for in the first place. And when he got there, he handed those hairs to the king and he said, "Here they are, give me my bride." And of course, at this point, there's nothing the king could say at this point. I mean, he did exactly what he said he was going to do. So the king gave them his blessing. But you need to remember, this king is very greedy and he loves gold. I told you that at the beginning. So when he saw these 4 bags of gold, he was more interested in those than anything else. So he asked the boy, "Where did you get all that gold?" Now you remember I told you that this boy was clever, right? So he looked that king right in the eye and he said, "I found this gold across the river." And so it was. The king hopped down from his throne. He jumped down the steps, got onto his horse, and rode straight for the river. And as soon as he got there, he saw the little man in the boat. And the king said, "You there, row me across the river so I can get rich." The man said, "Sure, of course, absolutely. Come, get into the boat." But the moment the king stepped in the boat, the little man thrust the oar into his hand, jumped out of the boat, and ran off to his freedom. Now, when the king did not return to the castle, the queen decided she didn't want to rule the whole land on her own, and so she made her daughter, the princess, and her husband, our main character, our protagonist, our hero, she made them the king and the queen. And they were so kind and so wonderful to everyone that they were everybody's favorite king and queen they'd ever had. And as for that nasty old king, that greedy old man, last I heard, he was still stuck in that boat rowing people back and forth across the river. but he was never able to get out of the boat himself. And that's all I'll tell you, because that's all I know. The end. Did you all enjoy that story? Did you catch what the 3 threes were in that story? Of course, the first 3 is the 3 in the title, the 3 golden hairs. The second 3 were the 3 times that the king tried to get rid of the boy. Remember, because first was with the box in the river, and second was with the note, and third was when he sent him after the golden hairs because he thought there's no way he's going to survive this giant who doesn't like people. The third set of 3s, do you remember? Those are the 3 questions that he got. You know, he got the question about the well, and then he got the question about the apple tree, and he got the question about the man in the boat. So those were our 3 sets of 3s. I hope you all picked up on those. I hope you really enjoyed that story. That's my favorite story ever, my favorite fairy tale, and I loved sharing it with you all. This really cool picture back here, I pointed to the giant and everything. This was made by a girl named Kaden, who painted it for us to go with our summer reading theme, Imagine Your Story. Hopefully one day soon you'll get to see it in person. It's really cool looking. It's got some fairy tale characters in it. It's going to be really awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, and join us again on Friday for another Tale of 3. And if you missed Sunday or Monday's Tale of 3, definitely go check those out as well, because those are all really great stories. And I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.